Yeah, so we are live. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I, Snigdha Basu, project lead of the Disobedient Girls series at Story.biz, welcome you to our fourth episode of the Talk series. I'm privileged to have with us Utkarsh Patel, Anuja chandramouli, and Urmi Chanda this evening to talk about disobedient women in Indian mythology. This session is also a tribute to Lata Mangeshkar. It's a very sad day for all of us. Um, a reminder that tellmeyourstory.biz calls for submissions on the story prompt Disobedient Girls. Other than that, registrations are also open for the writing program season 5 in association with Rupa Publications. We are also calling for submissions on beliefs and social customs for our June review. For more information, please visit our website. Let me begin today's session by introducing our speakers today. We have amongst us Utkarsh Patel. Utkarsh Patel is a lecturer of comparative mythology at the University of Mumbai and many other institutes and colleges in India. He's a TEDx speaker and author and has published 3 books. He is also a regular speaker and lecturer on varying subjects of mythology and other topics at various forums, lit fests, organizations, and colleges. Welcome, sir.
Hi, thank you.
We are also thrilled to have with us Anuja chandramouli. Anuja is a best-selling author and a New Age Indian classicist. Her debut novel Arjuna's Saga of a Pandava warrior prince was named as one of the top 5 sellers in the Indian writing category by Amazon India. Her other books include Kamadeva, The God of Desire, Shakti, the Divine Feminine, Rama's Lieutenant, and The Stone Witch, amongst many others. She is an accomplished TEDx speaker and storyteller. Anuja also regularly conducts workshops on creative writing, mythology, and empowerment in schools, colleges across the country. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
We are also happy to have with us Urmi Chanda. Urmi straddles many domains, including journalism, academia, and recently nonprofit. She trained to be a clinical psychologist before moving on to make a career in journalism. After a decade in different media organizations, she went on to study Indology and then got into independent research and writing. Currently, she is pursuing her professional doctorate as a Harmony Scholar from University of Wales in Trinity St. Day and is also associated with 2 nonprofit organizations, the Indian Documentary Foundation and Seeds of Peace. In her spare time, she moonlights as a podcaster, being the voice of Dr. Happy Podcast. Welcome, Urmi.
Thank you, Snigdha.
In today's session, we will be talking about disobedient women from Indian mythology. In Indian mythological fiction, there has been a surge in feminist retellings of the narratives. The representation of women has evolved from being portrayed as props or being catalysts for the hero's journey to being models of agency and power that women today can relate to. With that, now I would like to welcome our speakers to shed light on today's topic of discussion. Utkarsh, sir, would you like to be our trailblazer?
Okay, I think it's no more time to say ladies first because that might be seen as a very incorrect statement here. So I'll go ahead. The first thing that we must understand is the word disobedience. Disobedience now versus disobedience in the mythical times is very, very important to understand. And disobedience by a woman is even different. For a man or for a mythical character who's a man, disobedience could just be rebellion, going against the time, asking for changes, etc. But when a woman disobeys in mythology, that could be seen as a very, very big crime, misdemeanor, transgression. We have different words for these kind of things. So, woman's disobedience could lead to even a curse. And we've seen in so many cases that when a woman disobeys in mythology, it calls for a bigger punishment than a man's disobedience. So, what is disobedience? Is something that the parameter has to be said that if a woman disagrees to a man's diktats, man's suggestions, man's orders, is what in mythology we call that as disobedience by a woman. She could just be right. She could just be suggesting a change. She could just be, asking to be looked at. She could just be asking to be taken seriously, something that even a man would do in mythology, but she gets punished or she gets criticized or she gets cursed. And that's what we are referring to disobedience. I think that's is my understanding of disobedience. Before we you ask questions, anybody else wants to add something? Please feel free.
I agree with Utkarsh, except for one thing. He said, it's when women act or raise their voices against something which men have said or dictated. But I would say it's men and women because all these rules and regulations which came into being, the intentions were good. The intentions were good. We have to acknowledge that. Like my dad says, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So the idea was to keep women safe, protect them from, I don't know, from men who would violate their modesty, chastity, whatever. So, they'd always give you reasons for why you're not allowed to do this, why you're not allowed to do that. So, so for a woman to find the courage and conviction to do her thing, it took a lot of guts because the stakes were so high. Like Utkarsh lightly pointed out, he said that, it basically it's high stakes for women to go out there and break the rules. They get cursed, they get killed, and people always say, I told you so. So it took a lot of gumption to go ahead and do it, and they had to face resistance, punishment, and yet at times it was worth it. That's the hope which we all cling to. It pays to follow your heart, it pays to do what you believe in. And that's why women in mythology have been such great role models, especially when they took the path less traveled at the risk of being called disobedient women who deserved the bad things they had to face.
Um,
Thank you.
I'm just going to bring in a small point about subversion rather than disobedience, and highly relevant in like today. I can think of Lata Mangeshkar because subversion. As a woman who is single, who chose never to marry, is a big kind of subversion. From considering the milieu she came from, and I feel. As in mythology, similarly in life, only those who are phenomenally talented, who can compensate for that subversion or disobedience in some way, who can justify that, sort of get away with it. Important to understand that the price, like Anuja said, the stakes are much higher for an ordinary woman. So it would only becomes something of a role model when there's a huge compensation like that. Sita also comes to mind, a very unlikely example when we are speaking of disobedient because she's the epitome of obedience. But her defiance and wanting to follow the rules. I'm also thinking about these girls in Karnataka, the current hijab controversy. Where they're wanting to follow the rules, and but they're defying authority or they're disobeying authority of another kind. So it's important to tie this back to contexts of the today and understand their relevance in everyday life. So yeah.
Thank you. So, Utkarsh, sir, and Anuja, ma'am, would you like to introduce us to some of the disobedient women from your books?
Yeah, Anuja, go ahead.
I think most of my women characters were all rebels. I think they didn't do what was considered the norm. So I wrote about Shakti, the divine feminine, and she wasn't exactly known for obeying convention. So people see Shakti as an instrument of creation or destruction. People forget that those two concepts are poles apart. There are worlds in between, multiverses, multitudes in between, and it's like we insist on seeing someone as complicated as Shakti in black and white, and that kind of trickles down to how women are perceived as either a saint or a sinner, or to be more accurate, a slut. But I don't think any of us know any woman who can be described using only those terms, sinner, saint, slut. Every woman is everything. So complicated. The many faces of Shakti. That was what I tried to explore. And we have the goddess of dawn, again, who was a rebel, who was one of the foremost goddesses worshipped in the Rig Veda. And she was driven away from the heavens by Indra when he hurled his thunderbolt at her. But that wasn't the end of her, right? She came back stronger than ever before in a new avatar. She continues to be adored in her many forms. So, that was it with Shakti. And then you have Ganga. One of my favorite little stories about Ganga is that originally the rishis, the Sapta rishis led by Brahma, approached her and they asked her to perform penances to win Shiva as her consort. And you know the legend behind it. Padma was causing havoc in the world. Shiva and Shakti needed to be united. They had to provide a heir to battle this menace. So Ganga was approached first. Parvati was the younger sister, and they approached Ganga, and she said, "Why should I do that? Why can't Shiva perform penances to win my hand?" And they called her the disobedient one for that, the crooked one. Brahma called her that. But it didn't change her mind. They couldn't persuade her to do something which was so alien to her nature. She couldn't be held down. She still can't be tied down. Today, we kind of, restrict her to the role of a mother whose job is to put up with all the crap her children do to her, be gentle and patient, even as we pollute and defile this mother goddess. But she's so much more than that. She was always more than that, a powerful, powerful goddess. So I think, and even Mohini defies gender. She defies everything that you can possibly think of when you think of a woman. So this is a theme which I've adored, and by exploring these themes, I think I've learned so much more about myself than I've ever wanted to. And these stories, they're so special to me, and so relevant. And I'm so glad I get the opportunity to share these stories.
Something very similar to what Anuja said about the women that I've written about. They haven't really been disobedient, and if they have been, they've been disobedient in a very different way. I mean, the women I've written for have been more of rebels. When I say rebels, in the sense they've been very different from the traditional mold of what was expected of women. For example, Shakuntala. I've written about Shakuntala of Vyas, not of Kalidas. There's a big difference there. And Shakuntala of Vyas was an extremely intelligent, independent, and a fiery woman. She remember the fact that she was one of the first women characters of Mahabharata. And what you see later on in Amba and Draupadi or even Kunti, all were assertive in their different ways. If Draupadi was vocal and assertive, Kunti was also assertive without having to raise her voice. So Shakuntala was a woman who was an individual. She had a mind of her own. Staying, in an ashram, she decides to get married without taking anybody's permission or without speaking to anybody. Which, by itself, you got to give it to her because she hasn't seen the world outside. She takes that decision, and whatever she has to undergo, she does it all alone. She doesn't blame anybody. She doesn't blame the god. She doesn't blame destiny like everybody would do even today. And then she faces it all by herself. She goes to Hastinapur all by herself. She faces, and there's this brilliant speech written by Vyas in Mahabharata where she stands up in the court of Hastinapur and blasts Dushyant. I mean, that speech, if you read, is something that you can imagine that way back, thousands of years back, an author like Vyas conceived those dialogues to a woman. When we can say patriarchy, we can say whatever we want to say, but those dialogues and showing Hastinapur's king, uh, Dushyant, in such poor light. Remember, in Vyas, there is no Durvasa Muni, there is no temporary amnesia, no nothing of that sort. It's not a fantasy, it's hardcore real world. And to create a character like that, I'm sorry, you got to give it to that man. Then comes Satyavati. Satyavati has always been seen as somebody on the, if people have learned their Mahabharata only from TV screen, then you would have seen Satyavati standing on the sides wearing a white and, the sad woman. No, she was not. She was a woman who could take her own decisions. And, there is this big thing about men and women fighting battles. Men fight battles in the battlefield. Women fight different kind of battles, and that's why, unfortunately, you have to understand that women are also brave. They are also heroic, but they are not carrying swords and lances in their hand and defeating demons. They are fighting something much more important: oppression. They are fighting patriarchy. They are fighting a huge amount of domination from the menfolk. And Satyavati was so intelligent that despite having to give in to a much older man's advances, even earlier during Sage Parashar's time, she makes sure that she gets her revenge. And I think one of the most classic revenge against men and against the Kshatriyas that she takes is that after her children, there wasn't a single pure Kshatriya Kuru blood in any one of them. Right from Dhritarashtra, Pandu, and thereafter, they were none of them were Kshatriyas. None of them were even Kuru blood. No royal blood in them. A woman doesn't have to really go and stab and say, I've taken my revenge. This is a revenge of generations. And I think that that complete aspect has been sidelined, and the fact that not a single decision did Bhishma take without consulting Satyavati. One can say what one wants to, but that was the reality. And the third character I wrote about is Kannagi, who in my opinion is the only woman who has an epic on her shoulders. Epics always rest on the shoulders of men, be it Achilles or be it Odysseus, be it Ram, be it Krishna, Arjun, whoever. Here is a woman who carries the epic on her shoulders. No battles, no divine intervention, but a rustic woman who's never stepped out of her own village has the gumption to barge into the king's court and demand justice. In my opinion, that itself was a huge act of rebellion. Instead of succumbing, to your destiny, that you come to a new land and you lose your husband, no, she doesn't. She fights for justice. She gets her husband exonerated of the crime that he was supposed to have committed, which he didn't. And not only that, she burned the entire city to ashes. I'm not saying that that was a great thing, but I'm just saying that it was in her. It was in the powers that she had to burn a city. Remember, I mean, Draupadi also got the entire menfolk, sort of killed, those who insulted. But Draupadi still had to, take the help of menfolk around her. Kannagi didn't. Kannagi did it all by herself. Got to give that woman, her due. Yep, these are the three women I've written about, and there are many, many women which come to my mind. But Urmi is muted herself, so I think I'll let her speak.
Yeah. Would you like to mention some of the names that come to your mind when we talk about the Sufi women in Indian mythology? To
Um,
Urmi.
no, not particularly, but I was just listening to Utkarsh sir, and one thing that jumped out at me, especially in Carnegie's case, and this whole power of women trope. Uh, Unfortunately, for the longest time, this power has been vested in the idea of chastity of women. So only a chaste woman is able to unleash her fury. Otherwise, it's as if she has no right to be angry. Like only if you're the Sati Savitri type can you make a noise if someone molests you. Otherwise, you're, as Anuja said, you're a slut. So if you're sexually liberated, then your violation doesn't count. So that is one. Because we are talking about contemporary retellings of mythology, I think that's one thing that has happened nicely. It's taken a while, but what I see evolving is this whole idea of sexual agency, because mythology, classically speaking, it's too vested in the idea of chastity, because of course it's been authored by within a patriarchal framework. But these reimaginings is what is changing that narrative, and which is why I think it's extremely relevant to readers today, and why it continues to resonate with this generation. So yeah, so not a character but this trope. And speaking of this generational power, again, as a journalist, I can't help but keep tying it back to contemporary events. I've been just reading Obama's his latest book, and he talks about how his mother was someone who basically did her own number. She married three times and essentially spent the rest of her life by herself. But then look at the man, the son that she created. So does not matter, where you're not really resting on the surname given to you by the person. It's your power and what you are able to generate from that. So for me, that's Mahabharata being created right here. That's Satyavati for me right here. So yeah, so these are examples of disobedient women who are producing great things, great people.
Thank you. So questions from the
Snigdha,
audience. Yeah, we will be
just
taking
one
those questions
thing.
maybe in one question. Yeah.
I'm sorry I interrupted you, Snigdha,
No,
but
it's fine. Go ahead.
I
Yeah.
just wanted to add something to what Urmi had said because it totally resonates, for Indian women, where she talked about how purity is a huge factor when it comes to establishing that a woman can be strong, that she can draw on those inner reserves of virtue to do something magical. But that is such a patriarchal concept. Obviously, it's so much in the male interest to keep women at home and just tell them, this is, you should think of only one man. But if you go through mythology itself, it's always been more tolerant of women who were sexually liberated. So I'll just share one example about from Devdasi lore, the temple dancers who are so misunderstood and so misrepresented today. There was one in particular called Manikam Nachir, and she was not held in very held as a high esteem because of what she did, because she was a courtesan. And when she entertained a gentleman caller at night, a very not even a gentleman, you can't call him a gentleman, he was just a traveling pilgrim. And he asked that they be united in wedlock, and she agreed, and they were married. They spent the night together, and the next morning she wakes up to discover that he's passed away at night. And she wore the widow whites, and she was mourning for this man she had loved over the night, because she'd taken him into her heart, and she'd only agreed to marry him because she loved him. And of course, she was scorned for it. People made fun of her for that. They said, imagine a whore claims to have a husband, a whore claims that she can mourn the passing of her husband. And as it turned out, this poor beggar who had spent the night with her was Shiva. And he came to life in front of all of them to prove that she was one of his greatest devotees, that she did not look at class, caste, none of those divides which continue to enslave us today. So Shiva had to prove to the world that this courtesan was actually one of his greatest devotees, and he honored her by coming on earth to wed her and prove to everyone that she was as virtuous as any other woman claiming to be virtuous, because she was loyal to only one man. So you'll find plenty of stories like this about the so-called disobedient women who may not have been, very powerful. They may not have been very talented. Take even the breast tax that were imposed in Kerala for the longest time, and Nangeli hacked off her breasts. An ordinary woman who somehow became more powerful than a king or queen because she believed in herself, the power of her femininity. She didn't need weapons. Utkarsh also said Kanagi didn't need weapons or anything of the sort. So it's an example for us women also, that we don't need to, do the male thing, grab weapons and go to war in order to actually fight a war.
Thank you, Anuja ma'am. So I have a question for Utkarsh. Sir, you mentioned that Shakuntala, that Kalidas immortalized, is very different from that of Vyasa's. What do you think is the reason behind such disparity in representation?
One thing we must understand, who was Kalidas. And Kalidas was a court poet of the Guptas, right? And being under the patronage of the kings, that is the Kshatriyas, writing about, a morally, questionable character who's a king and who's a Kshatriya, could get him into a bit of a trouble, or probably not, be well appreciated. However, to give him his due, Kalidas was a Sanskrit scholar, and he was well versed with the norms of Natya Shastra written by Bharat Muni. And according to the tenets of Natya Shastra, the two important things is that the hero must be a male, and that cannot be somebody whose morality can be questioned, right? So because of this important aspect, that the hero's morality cannot be questioned, maybe Dushyant was shown as not somebody who just kind of had a nice time in the forest and went back home. So that aspect of Durvasa Muni coming in, and the temporary amnesia and all that stuff was there. Also, the signet ring. which has a very important role in Shakuntala's story, is kind of missing in Vyasa's story. And the logic that a lot of people, rather a lot of historians explain, is that the idea of signatoring came into the literary conventions much, much later. So so Kalidas making use of it was really not out of place, and that's why the signatoring, and around that time, literature was, the whole concept was gaining ground. So I think that's how he looked at it, and also probably he wanted to create a very different character. Remember, Vyasa's time and Kalidas's time, the social milieu and the social structure also must have undergone a huge change, probably, and I'm just putting a conjecture here, probably people might not have been able to digest such a strong vocal woman character. Also, it did not go with the whole idea of him creating a romantic play. In a romantic play, if the heroine stands at the end of it and blasts the man, the romance has gone out of the window, I guess. So, keeping that in mind, it was a pure lovelorn damsel in distress, shedding copious tears. All those went on well with the mood, and I think he was only retelling a story in his own way. And all said and done, it became a hit, and today it's one of the classic literature. So we believe that's the reason why Kalidas decided to change the character of Shakuntala. Unfortunately,
Thank
I
you.
must say. So,
So I have a question for Anuja, ma'am. You talked about Shakti, how an identification of being uh, the vessel of both creative and destructive forces can lead society to label women as either saints and sinners, and that is something that women today suffer as well. So, what are your thoughts on that?
No, it's one of the most frustrating things about being a woman in today's world. I think that we are still held to prehistoric standards, basically. Everyone has to have some sort of label. Today, there are more choices, of course. You have to say, okay, I'm liberal, I'm emancipated, or I'm a homemaker, and you have to apologize for that also. You're like, okay, I'm just because I'm a homemaker doesn't mean I don't have ambitions, stuff like that. It's always like women always have to deal with being pigeonholed, because I don't think, frankly, I don't think people can handle complicated women. I think it's nice if it's convenient for society if women do as they're told, and don't make life unnecessarily complicated for themselves or others. But I don't know. I don't think women can be held back like that, because Shakti is the force that animates all in existence. They say Shiva is Shava, or a corpse without Shakti. So that is the power of Shakti. It's always been intimidating. And when I say Shakti, I'm not talking only about women, because the forces of Purusha and Prakriti, Shiva and Shakti, you find that in everything in existence. Whether it's human, we're talking about human beings, whether we're talking about animals, whether we're talking about a rock, this is the makeup of all things in existence. And so we need to understand that men are also scared to embrace the Shakti within. So, patriarchy claims victims on either side of the sex gender divide. So, it is something that we should just be aware of, that we know women themselves. I think a lot of us are very apologetic about how powerful we are. Ambitious women are constantly feeling guilty because they want everything. There's nothing wrong with that. You want a great career, you want a great family life, you want it all. There's nothing wrong with that. And yet, despite knowing that at a conscious level, we kind of feel bad about it. We feel we have to compensate for who we are. And I think what we do when we try to retell these stories from mythology is to make our peace with the conflict within, and to make the peace with the conflict without. So it's a twofold happening here, and it is something we all wrestle with endlessly. It's going to happen till the end of time. I'm not telling this to say there's no hope or anything. I'm just saying these things happen. You have these opposing, equal and opposing forces within and without. So it's always going to be a struggle, but it's okay. It's okay. If there's, like I said, there's throughout history, women have overcome obstacles. Women have torn each other down. Yes, we've also propped each other up. Men have been against women, but there are men who come forward and give you a hand up, a leg up. So it's that is what it is. You have to take the bitter with the better, prepare for the worst, hope for the best, and keep moving forward one step at a time. And hopefully, we arrive at a place where the powers of Purusha and Prakriti can exist in a state of balance.
Thank you, ma'am. Urmi, would you like to add something?
Not really. I just thought I'd bring up one character who we've not brought up yet, and who happens to be my favorite character of Radha. Speaking of disobedience, she's not usually somehow I feel she's missed out, but who better than Radha? Then, of course, the bhakti tradition has its own justifications, about she being Lakshmi and that being the divine purpose and so on and so forth. But since we are talking on earthly terms, Radha's defiance and disobedience for the sake of love is one of the greatest and worshipable examples. So not all disobedience is bad, or goes in the bad books of society, which people want to shove under the carpet. There are also examples of disobedient women who are worshipped, and Utkarsh sir will tell you about the Panchakanya of mythology, who are all also worshipped, all again disobedient in their own rights. So this conversation is very much about women who should be adored, should be and have been adored in mythology, have sort of been brought into this fantastic framework that balances things out. So it's not always about virtue, it's also through disobedience that this path to newer possibilities is created. Only when you break a norm, only when you disobey, is possibilities created. So yeah.
I just, since Urmi brought up Radha, I'm just thrilled she brought up Radha. And she pointed out that in some versions they believe she was an incarnation of Lakshmi. And I stumbled upon a version where she was an incarnation of Ganga. And I was super intrigued. So in
Oh.
Ganga, this is a bit of just a bit of creative reinterpretation. But in my book on Ganga claims she wants something when she's asked to, take birth on earth and bear all of Shantanu's children. And she's hugely reviled for that because she's seen as a monster who killed her newborn infants. Though she was asked to do that,
Hmm.
that was a huge ask, by the way. So Ganga,
Hmm.
I felt she's not the sort of she's not your typical goddess. So she made sure she got something out of this deal. And it's one of my favorite passages in Ganga where she says that in return for what's being asked of her, she says, I choose satisfaction over sacrifice. And I must have this love which is perfect. I want a love that transcends all conventional mores. I want bliss without any of the guilt or the heartbreak attached with it. So, so she did get her Ras Leela. And Radha and Krishna, they are simply, beyond any of the limitations which civilized spiteful society imposes on lovers. They say that she was older than Krishna, that she was married at the time, but you
Yeah.
get the feeling that with the two of them, nothing matters. They
Yeah.
were two halves of the same heart, the same soul, the same body. And they say, the gods, that Shiva himself came to view their union and
Hmm.
they were preserved forever in that perfect moment. So that's like one of my favorite stories. I just love, and I think that today's youth also, we should emulate Ganga. When we are asked to give of our time, of our heart, of our life, we should make sure that we are adequately compensated for all the effort we put in. And I'm not talking only of monetary satisfaction, though that's very important, very, very important. I just feel we should get paid our dues and we should make sure that we get paid our dues.
Thank you. So we lastly talked about the Indian goddesses from mythology. I have a few kind of questions on Supernakha. So to Urmi, we know Urvashi's story. It's sort of similar to that of Suparnakhas. They are both women who made improper advances to get the man. They both acted on their desires, but it is Suparnakha who is horribly and horribly mutilated and slain, and not Urvashi. Do you think it was her appearance that resulted in such a difference in treatment?
Uh, Definitely yes, but I feel that's just one reason, because there are versions of the Ramayana where Surpanakha, makes an appearance in her beautiful form. So if it was just about the exterior, it should not have mattered, because on the outside she was just as beautiful as, say, an Urvashi. But I think a bigger thing, a bigger problem that is indicated in this story, apart from the gender bias, apart from the bias of appearances, is also the whole caste thing. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but the whole and we won't split hairs right now about who the Aryans are, who the Dravidians are, but generally speaking, because Shurpanakha is an outsider, Urvashi has the license of being with the top tier, the creme de la creme. She belongs. She comes from there. No more matter what her vision, what her mission may have been. No matter so that is forgiven. In the same way, transgressions are forgiven a lot more easily when they are done by, say, the white man or the Hindu Brahmin male, or people from privileged socioeconomic classes get away with it. But when the same transgressions are committed by people of a socio-economic class that is considered lower, you know, they have to face far more consequences, and that's exactly what happened with her. So, yes, so the blow was triple fold for her. Not just was she ugly, or that she expressed her sexual desire. She also belonged to a class that was antithetical to the heroes of this particular story. So yeah, so that's where I think it comes from.
So do you think how Lakshman reacted the way he did, it was to set a norm of public behavior for women? I was reading Utkarsh sir's blog and he mentioned it there.
Of course, no, it's isn't it always that it's all. See, any harsh punishment, by law, is meant to set an example for society. It's meant to deter other people. So it's a consequence to action. So even in Ram's killing of Shambhuka, which is again a transgression of a certain category, why did he have to kill? This is Ram Rajya and he's the best. Similarly, Lakshman, he's Ram's brother, but he does such a thing that is so brutal. That's clearly to set an example, not because she threatened Sita. So very few things in the Ramayana actually make proportional sense. A lot of it is symbolic. It is to set that particular, use it, hold it up as a head on a stake, so that others will not do it. You dare not, how dare you look at me? How dare you come to me? That sort of a thing. So definitely, yeah, setting an example is definitely one of Lakshman's reasons.
So would you like to add something?
Oh,
Yeah, Utkarsh, are you going to say something?
no, no, go
Or,
ahead, carry.
yeah,
Go ahead.
so I agree with what Urmi said. We can all agree that Lakshmana's actions were excessive, to say the least. He actually lopped off her breasts and her nose. It's I've never forgiven him for that, by the way. Though I try not to get too emotional about all this. But in see, the Rakshasas and Rakshasis are so often vilified because I think they always did not accept the rules which governed conventional society. They were always outside of that. And I feel that in mythology, they aren't treated as villains for that. It's seen as two sides of the same coin, the Devas and Asuras. It's just that, again, we look at things in black and white, so it's convenient for us to cast them as villains. In Surpanakha's case, she didn't do anything that was unusual for a Rakshasi. She was a widow and stuff, but Rakshasis were sexually liberated. In the Mahabharata, there's a story where they say that Rakshasi women were so keen on love making. That was something they were very passionate about, something they enjoyed without guilt. So Parvati gave them a boon. She said, as soon as they give birth to a child, this child will achieve maturity immediately, become a full grown adult, so the mother doesn't have to miss out on lovemaking, which I thought was a brilliant story because it's Parvati who gave them this boon. It had her sanction. She was very understanding of their needs. The fact that they were so unapologetic about their sexual desires. From then to now, women who are empowered, liberated sexually constitute a minority. And it's always uncomfortable for the majority because we are taught that there's just one man for one woman. That's where your chastity, your virtue is tied. So we're looking at two extremely diverging viewpoints, and this is what happens. They keep repeatedly, there are men like Lakshmana who try to make examples of these so-called wayward women, although actually Surpanaka didn't do anything out of the pale for a Rakshasi. And that's just what I wanted to say. It's just two differing viewpoints, and we if you're on Twitter, you know that we are not very comfortable with agreeing to disagree. I think that's the problem. That's the bane of human existence, that you're so unwilling to accept a viewpoint which is at odds with yours.
So, would you like to add something?
See, the way I look at Surpanaka and Surpanaka is very simple. There are two characters at that stage. One is Sita, the other is Surpanaka. Sita is what the storyteller is trying to tell you what a woman ought to be like. Follow your husband, walk two steps behind, don't argue with him, listen to him, do his bidding. Surpanakha is the alter ego of Sita, if you look at it. She is everything that Sita is not, and she's everything that the storyteller doesn't want a woman to be. For example, when Surpanakha approaches Ram and says, "Marry me," Ram is supposed to have made fun and said, "No, no, not me. I'm not interested. Go ask my brother. He might." And in Valmiki's Ramayana, there is a physical description of the way Surpanakha conducts herself and her body. And this is mentioned very clearly out there. And then Lakshman sends her back to Ram, and there is this back and forth happening, which is nothing but making fun of a woman by two men. Is it incorrect on her part to one at some point of time lose it? She just got wild at some point of time, and then she headed towards Sita. And in many versions, the Valmiki version, of course, simply says, Lakshman got angry and he did what he did. In many other versions, there are dialogues which are even more offensive in modern times to say that this is what a woman is. You can't trust her. A woman who's not bound to a man. That man can be the father initially, the husband then, and the son later on. If she's not bound, she's bound to behave like this. And I think in many of the versions it goes on, which is pretty offensive at times. But remember the fact that again, as you asked, it's a norm setting. The author or the storyteller is setting a norm, and these kind of stories were told in groups, in communities, where everybody's sitting together. And through this story, you're actually saying, telling the women audience, be a Sita, not a Surpanakha. Because Surpanakha, if you behave like this is what happens. A rebellious woman faces, the societal ostracism. Even today, for that matter, it's happening even today. In certain hinterland, you'll find the cops saying, okay, throw her out, blacken her face, shave her hair off. So we really haven't come a long way from then to now. The belief system is much the same, but that's how the society reacts to a person like Surpanakha. But I'm glad modern storytellers are looking at Surpanakha in a much, should I say, sympathetic way, and doing a good job. A lot of them, like Volga, for example, I can't stop but take her name, has done a fabulous job of interpreting Surpanakha in her book, and everybody should read that book.
Thank you. So, not just what he did to Suparnakha, even the Lakshman Rekha that he drew to limit Sita, it has different connotations. Would you like to talk about that as well?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Is it some kind of a conspiracy that get all the patriarchal questions to Utkarsh so that he has to stand up for all of them? No, don't worry. I have my very strong views on the Lakshman Rekha. Lakshman Rekha means a line, and Lakshman Rekha is nothing but a limiting line. All that you see, flames go up and all that is not correct. It's just a limiting line, basically saying a woman belongs inside the threshold, and not outside. Of course, there are many authors who very sweetly say that she's safe inside the house, so let her say stay inside the house. Outside is the jungle Raj, so let her not step out. No, that's not actually the connotation. The connotation, very clearly, the line says you belong there. And if you step out, you only step out under the chaperone of a man, not otherwise. And I think the whole line, and thereafter she being kidnapped, is a way of saying this is what happens when you don't listen to the diktats of a man. When you were told that stay inside, why did she not stay inside? So I think it's a it's a very clearly an example of patriarchal framework as to where a woman belongs. A woman belongs inside the threshold of the house and not outside. I mean, I don't see it any other way. It's no magical line. It simply says it very clearly that it's a limiting line. That's a limit. You don't go beyond that. Do not cross. You know, it's the in Marathi we have this word called umbartha. You know, don't cross that point, and that's where a woman belongs. There is no other interpretation other than this. I'm very clear on that.
Would Anuja or Urmi like to add something?
I think
Oh,
Utkarsh pretty much summed it up. But just to add to what he said, Sita was this classic case of an extremely obedient woman who disobeyed once in her life, and she paid such a heavy price for it. And
Yeah.
what I would say is, yes, it's true. See, in a way, the epics, like I said, the heart is in the right place when it comes to these storytellers. They warn you, they warn women that then or yesterday, today, or tomorrow, the stakes will always be higher for women. Always. You make a mistake, you pay a price for it, whatever it is. But I would say, accept that, but don't use it as an excuse to limit yourself, to stay home, be safe the way everyone's telling you to. I would say be smart about the choices you make. And if something bad happens, either because of a decision you took, or even if it's not your fault, whatever it is, don't feel bad about the things that happen to you over which you have no power. Actually, Sita had no, she could not fight off somebody like Ravana, right? So what happened to her wasn't her fault. Whether she disobeyed or not, it's not her fault. We need to understand that today. We need to tell ourselves, I will hold my head high even if I make a mistake, especially if I make a mistake. Own your mistakes, hold your head up high. Don't let anyone feel ashamed, make you feel ashamed of the choices you have made. Stand by them, own your mistakes, and keep moving forward. Keep going from strength to strength, because you can. And if you want to curl up at home and just watch Netflix, that's fine as well. Don't apologize for it.
Thank you. So my final question. So we largely talked about the feminist retellings, but to look at it from a different point of view, do you think the modern reinterpretations of the earlier narratives can lead to inaccuracies or even lead to criticism for not being in line with culture or tradition?
I'll go first here, because I feel very strongly about the word culture, and the big deal that is made of it. First thing first, the idea that culture is fixed is flawed. Culture is evolving. Culture is what is now, what will be tomorrow. There is nothing fixed in space and time that can be defined as Indian culture. So every time people use Indian culture as a shield, behind which they like to stand and commit atrocities against communities, against women, against Dalits, and so on and so forth. Indian culture के नाम पे, Indian tradition के नाम पे, but because even our epics, that the women that we're discussing today, uh, Valmiki's Ramayana isn't the only Ramayana. 300 versions and counting. Including these little stories that come up by the authors of today. Every Ramayana is equally valid. Similarly, the Mahabharata and every other big and small folk tales. So everything constitutes culture. It changes as it goes along. So when someone says it can be misinterpreted, as a vis-a-vis ancient culture, it's not misinterpretation, it's only a readaptation, because that's precisely the purpose of stories. Stories, like cinema, like novels, art is what captures the milieu, and that's what it's supposed to do. And if it changes, that's only because time has changed, people have changed, the ideas, the values of people have changed. So all of it comes into these reinterpretations, and I think that's perfectly valid, and that's exactly how it should be. The classics are the classics, they should be read for what they are worth, but the reinterpretations have their own value, and they have something new to teach us and tell us about our time, and we should celebrate it. Yeah.
Would anyone else like to add something?
I would just want to add here that this is not reinterpretation. It's time, and I've always been advocating this very strongly, that it's time to what we call revisioning of mythology. Time and again, we've read them as they were. But times have changed. As Urmi says, times have changed. Social milieu has changed. Understanding, standards, value systems, everything has changed. Also, what has happened is many of the stories have not been told the way they ought to have been. So you can take the story and retell it. If Kalidas did it, Bhasa did it, everybody retold the story. They didn't tell exactly the way the story was told. So if they have reinterpreted it, I'm not comparing any of the authors with the likes of let's say a Kalidas or a Bhasa, but the fact still remains that a story needs to be told for its present milieu. And if it's time to pull out a certain story from under the rug, which has been pushed for X number of reasons, it's time to tell those stories. There is no harm. And remember, mythology has always, and the stories that have been told have always had a very, very strong androcentric gaze. That gaze needs to be changed. That gaze needs to be questioned today. So a story, if it's giving you a feminist interpretation, there is no harm, because the story needs to be retold for a new audience, for an understanding. Also, this, I completely agree with Urmi on the culture thing that she said, is that it's also, if the culture had a question there, it's time to re-ask that question, to say that, was that right or was that wrong? And if it was wrong, let's just accept it that it was wrong. It doesn't show any of us in the, rather I would say it shows you in the wrong light if you're not willing to question which was already wrong. So let's call a spade and say this was bad and this was good. And here is a story that I kind of revision for the new audience. And no, it doesn't change the inaccuracies. People have done it time and again. And I think modern storytellers are interpreting it in a beautiful way, different way. I think everybody should accept the revisioning aspect, which is extremely important today.
Anuja ma'am, do you want to add something? No? Then we will be taking up a few questions from the audience. Um, Let me check.
Will you be also looking at some of the issues that grapple the urban woman of today and share some insights? I'd love to hear your views on Jamem. Yeah, I think that's pretty much what we've been doing over the course of our discussion today. It's not like mythology and the women from the past should be relegated to the past where they belong. I think they're very much a part of our lives. Mythology has been weaponized here and there to bolster patriarchal narratives, and they've also, for many women, and men, and let's not leave Utkarsh out of it. For him, when he writes about Kannagi, or when we're talking about Surpanaka, I think it's so liberating and empowering for us, because we learn so much that's beautiful from the past, and it helps you to navigate the treacherous terrain of the present and gives you an insight about how you can tackle the future as well. So I would say use it as a foundation. These stories from mythology, it's sort of like driving a car. You need to glance at the rear view mirror once in a while, but that doesn't mean you take your eyes off the wheel or the road ahead. So, it would be stupid to become obsessed with mythology. And, Urmi put it beautifully when she spoke about culture being a constantly shifting, evolving entity with infinite permutations. So keep an open mind, because we are wrestling, like I mentioned earlier, we are wrestling with some of the things women wrestle with. It's age old. It doesn't mean it's going to vanish tomorrow in a puff of smoke. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. Our children, our daughters, our granddaughters, they will have the same issues, but that's okay. Like I said, we are strong enough to deal with anything life throws our way.
I'd like to add a tiny point here, if I may, Snigdha. Since we're talking about culture, another term that gets, I don't know, correctly or incorrectly associated with this is history, and this insistence of certain people to, you know, think of mythology as history, because the epics are called itihasa and it comes from there, and there are arguments about how this was real, this is not mythology, this is history. Whatever the case may be, even for people, the class of set of people who believe that this is history, uh, Anuja's arguments, Utkarsh's arguments, my arguments remain the same. Doesn't matter if it is history or it is mythology. Even if these are, role models taken from, say, real life examples turned into stories, it still doesn't change the fact that they represented a certain time which was different from the time we live in. So, whatever you choose to believe in, what you want to do with these heroines, disobedient, obedient, the important thing is to recontextualize to our times and apply their relevance accordingly, instead of sticking to हमारे शास्त्रों में ऐसा लिखा है मतलब ऐसा ही होगा. It cannot be that way. So yeah, so I just wanted to bring that point up.
Thank you. So we have another question from Vijali Dio. Where can we find the story of Radha being incarnation of Ganga be found?
Actually, it's there in my book, Ganga, the Constant Goddess, but that's the short answer. Lots of people, they get intrigued by characters from mythology, and it's a very polarizing subject. You might not agree with my viewpoint. You might not agree with Utkarsh's or Urmi's, which is why I always say, if do the research yourself, explore the Puranas on your own. Why should you receive information secondhand? Go and look for the characters who fascinate you. Who the hell knows what you'll find along the way? It's a fascinating journey. You should take it up yourself.
Do we have any more questions? So Sheila Iyer wants Anuja ma'am to share her thoughts on the issues that grapple urban women of today.
Hey Snigdha,
Um,
we did that. I took that
You
question.
just
We
did.
covered that.
so I
Yeah.
think that was all. Um, it was a pleasure to have you all today. It's a very fascinating area, something I want to work with later on. Um, Thank you for being such wonderful panelists. It was a pleasure to listen to you all today. And I think that marks the end of today's session. Once again, thanks for your time this evening. A reminder to the audience that yourstory.biz calls for submissions on the story front to Disobedient Girls. Other than that, registrations are also open for the writing program season 5 in association with Rupa Publications. Till then, stay well, stay safe, stay together, too distanced. Good night.
Thank you, Snigdha. Thanks, Utkarsh. Thanks,